This is a story about 6 men who are asked to touch different parts of the elephant and see what it was that they touched. And of course, there was one person who touched the side of the elephant and said, "This is a wall," and someone else, another blind person, touched the ears of the elephant and said, "It's a fan," and someone else touched the leg and said, "This is the trunk of a tree," and so on, they touched the tail and said, "This is the brush," and so on. And there are those who are watching who very well knew that you need to see the whole picture to be able to understand what it is, what the creature was. And unfortunately, when it comes to something like the economic system that we are all part of willy-nilly, the globalized capitalist economic system, is something much, much bigger than an elephant. It's much, much more complex, much more difficult for us to understand. And it's not just in the story. There were a few people who could watch these guys who could not see and tell them, "Hey, this is not a leg, this is not a tree, this is not a wall, but this is an elephant." But unfortunately, when it comes to looking at the whole economic system we have, almost all of us have been blinded in some way or the other, at some point of time or the other. It's a journey of learning for all of us, journey of understanding more and more deeply what is it, that makes the system tick? What is running it behind the scenes? How is it that all of us are, running around in our own little worlds, doing our own thing, maybe quite happy with many of the things for all you know, but yet there are many things going wrong. And we hope that in this conference, we not only understand some of the problems of this kind of, this big elephant that the globalized economic system is, but also I think this conference is also about being happy with what we can, looking at stories of, positive initiatives which are already around the world trying to deal with this whole issue. And it's a story, definitely, many stories we hope will come out of this conference of hope and how we can work with this in our own lives and maybe together in many ways and so on.
So this is a story a long time ago. In a little village, one day there's a rumor that there is a sage who's come and he's sitting under a tree on the outskirts of the village. And the rumor also says that whatever you ask this person, he will give you, and smiling. So different people come and they ask for his blessings, they ask for advice and many different things, and he gives it to them. There is this one man in the village who wants to sort of test the boundaries of this giving. And he comes to the sage and says, I really don't have things to drink at home, and I have this little pot that the sage has. Can you give that to me? So sage says, "Sure," and he gives it. And this guy goes home feeling, "Oh, great, that was nice." And he comes the next day and says, in the night I don't really have a mat to sleep on. So sage gets up, gives the mat to him and smiles. And he comes the third day and the sage says, "What do you want?" And he says, in the night sometimes I feel really, really cold and I don't have a shawl. The shawl that you're wearing is really nice. Can you give that? And the sage says, "Sure." And he smilingly gives that also. Now when this guy comes home, he is restless, really, really restless. And the next day morning, the first thing he does is gets up, picks up all the things that he has asked from the sage, goes to him. And the sage says, "What do you want?" And this guy gives back all his things and says, "Give me that which makes you give away these things in a smiling way." Yeah. 2.5 years ago, on my first trip to Ladakh, when I had no idea what it was about, etc., and we were traveling from Kashmir, I happened to lay my hands on this book by Helena Norberg, The Ancient Futures. And by the time I reached Leh, I had read the book and experienced it in a very real way. And something which struck me was the honesty with which she has shared her experiences in that book. Helena is here with us for this conference. This is the third conference. The first one was at Berkeley in the US. The second one was in Australia, and the third one, and like Sita said, we're lucky to have her here.
And I want to thank also my friends and colleagues who have come from around the world. Some of us have been working together now for several years, and we're building up an international alliance for localization, for happiness, for health and happiness. That's what we're about. And I also want to say special thanks to my colleagues and friends from Ladakh who have traveled down from Ladakh. Some of us have worked together for almost 40 years, and I'm so happy to have you here. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming here today and hopefully joining in this historic turning point, turning away from a system that, as Sita was saying, is an elephant, a very, very big elephant. It is the elephant in the room, this system. And as she was saying too, many of us are still blind to that system. But there is a growing movement, a wake-up movement that is a direct systemic shift in the opposite direction. And that is away from the global elephant towards a multitude of thriving communities and local initiatives. So this movement, localization, is happening around the world. Interestingly enough, it's perhaps strongest in the United States, where the weight of a corporate elephant has destroyed identity, community, livelihoods, and happiness in such a major way that you find a multitude of initiatives. And in fact, I would say that perhaps the capital of the new or relocalization movement is Portland, Oregon. And that's where we plan to have our 4th international conference in September. But all across the country, you're finding this awareness that we need to do what we can to support local businesses, decentralized energy. Very central to all of this is, of course, local food. And what this is about, as I was saying, is a systemic shift away from an elephant that consists not just of deregulated banks that are allowed to create money out of thin air. It exists not only out of that money system, but also it's pushed to knowledge systems, or rather one monocultural knowledge system globally. So in reaction to that is this support for diversity, for small scale, for human scale, ecologically adapted, socially adapted ways of doing things. We're talking about human and ecological well-being being structurally linked to shorter distances. May seem strange, but shorter distances between production and consumption are essential for truly ecological ways of living. They are also essential for rebuilding a sense of community, of interdependence, of rediscovering who we really are. We are interdependent beings. This applies in every aspect of our life. And it's wonderful to see the proliferation of initiatives. These are just a few examples, mainly from the United States. And of course, here in India, the local economy, local community, local knowledge systems are still so much more alive. So you are here possibly as the potential leaders of this global movement. You really should think of this conference as a historic turning to recover your Indian roots, to recover what the greatest leader in the world in localization, as Rinpoche said, is Gandhiji. Gandhiji, this is your home, this is your heritage, and you have had, as a consequence, you have had a greater history of these local connections, the deep sense of interdependence and connection that is at the heart of localization. This is where happiness comes from. This is every spiritual teaching reminds us of that inextricable oneness, that interconnectedness, that interdependence of life. This is about our connection to nature and our connection to one another. I will talk in more detail about localization, but first I want to say something about the elephant, about globalization. I would like all of us to remember that when we talk about our governments, when we talk about left party, green party, right-wing parties, please remember to create a visual map that you keep in mind that Goldman Sachs and the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, Monsanto, Walmart, that there is a system there is an elephant that is actually voting more loudly than we are. We, the people below, vote in a supposed representative. What happens? The vote of the dollar from the outside, from foreign investment, from giants stalking the globe, wins. The money wins today. Now that money is also being created within the elephant by giant banks and corporations. The money is being created out of thin air. We've handed over the right to our supposedly national banks, our federal banks. No, they are private banks. Most people are now beginning to become aware of this. Very few, I think, are seeing it as a system. We need to understand that this is a system where money is speaking. Money is speaking through our school books, through the type of scientific research that's being promoted and funded. The scientific research that tells us that on a crowded planet we must have genetic engineering to feed the growing population. That's the money speaking that's been created without anybody asking us, without anybody telling us the truth of what's going on. This money is speaking through every avenue of knowledge. It isn't just the school books and the scientific research and the media, but virtually every bit of information, even in supposedly independent think tanks. When you do the research, you find that, unfortunately, a very large proportion are not independent of that big money and the big corporations. This money is also being used to subsidize the giants to get even bigger, to fund global infrastructures to suit global trade, global players. And while they are being deregulated, in other words, the rules regarding foreign investment and the mobility of these corporations is being rolled out as a red carpet. And at the same time, that money and those giant monopolies are pressuring governments everywhere to bring in regulations and rules, more and more bureaucracy, top-heavy bureaucracy, that's strangling the smaller, human-scale, more ecologically adapted, more humanly adapted ways of doing things. They're being strangled by bureaucracy. Now, as a consequence of that, what you find is that many voters around the world are becoming more, if you like, right-wing in the sense they're saying, government, get out of the way. Big, heavy bureaucracy rules, you're strangling us. And that came from those lefties and greenies. I've heard people in Australia say, the reason businesses are all disappearing off to China and India to produce is because the lefties were insisting on too much protection for their own labor, for their own labor unions. They hadn't been so greedy for the rights of their own labor, then all these businesses wouldn't be going elsewhere. This is a completely false analysis of the whys and the hows of why worldwide we have tremendous insecurity in terms of jobs, tremendous insecurity in terms of pensions. We really need that bigger picture, and I won't have time to belabor it too much longer, but please do remember that this systemic pressure of over-regulating the local and the national while deregulating the global, subsidizing the global while withdrawing funding for almost all our local and national needs worldwide, in my native country in Sweden too. The sort of welfare net that government was providing, sorry, can't afford it anymore. We don't have money. Going with their begging bowls to big business and big banks and saying, please, please, will you go into partnership, PPPs, public-private partnership. This is a disastrous system. I am convinced that the majority of people, including CEOs of big business, would not want to continue this rat race if they understood it in a systemic way. But it's up to us to lay that out. We need to talk to one another to understand better and to clarify and spell out why we are facing such a multitude of social, ecological and spiritual crises. We can see that there is a new economy movement growing. There's a broad-based coalition emerging in the United States right now. There's the New Economy Foundation in the UK. There's a new economy movement growing, and this is what we need, a movement for a new economy. At the forefront of that, I would maintain, as a pioneer of it, that local economies, localization is the forefront. Many in the new economy movement are still not, I believe, aware enough of the need to decentralize or localize for the reasons that Rinpoche spelled out. It's about survival, it's about biodiversity, it's about the survival of the living planet. We must decentralize. With decentralization and localization, what happens is that we are faced with the complexities of the living resources, the water, the soil, the seeds, the winds, the rains, the living ecosystem, which is our real economy. Whatever we use, the fanciest iPad, the new mobile phone, and of course the food we eat, the fibers we wear, everything comes from Mother Earth. And Mother Earth needs to stay alive if we want to stay alive. We must localize, as Rinpoche said. It's a question of whether we do it by choice or compulsion, because the other systems will break down. The other system where we allow banks to create more and more freely deregulated, speculative economy, in that system, that creation of phony money, we are allowing that to be our ruler. And I think anyone who wakes up to it is going to say, no, we don't want to continue that. So please join us in this movement to say no, a clear no to this top-heavy elephant. In order to do so, we need to be aware of the various, the tail and the leg and the ear and so on, and make sure that we're not supporting any aspects of it. And that may take a little bit of what I call economic literacy. So what we're looking for is a combination of eco-literacy, which consists of ecological literacy and economic literacy. That's the way forward. And I'd like to add that we're also talking about psychological literacy. If we could clearly see how this elephant system is affecting our children, if we could see that this is a worldwide phenomenon, that the need to sell, the need to create more consumers, and to create a consumerism that goes faster and faster and faster with built-in obsolescence, with fashions. The fashion industry has talked about changing the fashions for teenagers by the month instead of the year. So you have to buy new running shoes, new this, new labels. At the center of that system is a message to our children, and the children are responding as early as age 2 and 3. Many studies have been done. My friend Juliet Shaw in America has written a book called Born to Buy, because it actually starts almost right away at birth. The child is being targeted with a message that says, if you want to be loved, if you want to be someone, to have the admiration and the essentially community with your peer group, you must have the latest label. You must have the latest iPhone. When the child comes to you as a parent, desperate to have this latest thing and more and more and more and costly thing, if you say, no, you're not going to have that, it's like condemning them to isolation and loss of community. So we're in a very difficult position if we pursue the solution as isolated individuals. We must come together as communities, as regions, and at the policy level, at the societal level, to put an end to this crime. Because what's happening is that a commercial system is manipulating what is truly a universal human need, the need to be loved. Every child longs for that love, is a vulnerable little being looking for role models and looking for love and connection. Intervening in that universal human need for love to say you will only get that through consumerism. That's what's going wrong, and when you stand there as a lonely parent with your child, it's very difficult to say no. But if you collect, if you come together as an alternative school, at least form a group of friends to decide that we are going to do things differently. It is being done, more and more interest in alternative schooling, in homeschooling. People are walking out from the dominant system and creating alternatives. These alternatives take so many different forms. We showed just a few before, but even when parents choose to bring their children out into nature, living nature, to feel themselves experientially connected to the living world, out of things like a recognition in America of nature deficit disorder. Someone named Richard Lew wrote a very famous book about it. All these steps that are being taken to reconnect to nature and to reconnect to one another in a deep, heartfelt, open way, tearing down the boundaries of a showing-off identity. Aren't I clever? I've got a PhD from Harvard. I've got, the latest new car or the latest brand of iPhone. Those boundaries create misery. They create the deepest unhappiness, which is why part of what we need to do in India is to bring to our youth in India the statistics of the epidemic of depression in the Western world, United States at the top, but also in my native country of Sweden. As people are isolated and separated through this knife of consumerism and this consumer culture, it's leading to more and more isolation and frustration. Beware also that the internet, which is an essential tool for us to share information and to build this new movement, is a dangerous addiction for our youth. There is now more and more evidence that when young people go on Facebook, they come away feeling more depressed. What happens is they see their friends dressed up, looking exciting, looking sexy, in the latest fashions, and they feel that they're not as good. This is becoming a very widely recognized phenomenon. So bringing our children and ourselves back to face-to-face participatory cultural events. You have such a rich heritage here. You still have a tradition, I think, in most parts of India, of being able to sing together. In the Western world, we've been so trampled by the elephant for so long, we're afraid to sing. I was 60 years old before I had the courage to start singing. And even now, I wouldn't have the courage or Rinpoche to sing to you here on the stage, but I can sing in a group. The ability to sing, the ability to dance and make music together is an incredible wealth. This is just one of the many aspects of how localization is growing in 1,000,001 different ways. Revitalizing live, face-to-face culture. Revitalizing, as I say, those connections to nature. Economically, the structural framework that can really make it possible for us to have more time to sing, more joy in our lives, more community, healthier ecosystems, healthier identities, has to do with this economic localization. And there, beware of a lot of the co-optation. Microcredit generally is being used to pull people into dependence on a global, unstable financial market. When it goes into rural villages of India, don't believe the propaganda that this is the best way to raise people's standards of living. There's been a terrible mind control that has led people to believe that giving a bit of aid is patronizing, and this is not nearly as respectable as giving someone a loan. That's a fair business partnership, whereas giving a donation is patronizing. It's complete rubbish. Of course, aid that creates dependence is not a good thing, but there has been a lot of aid that was about helping people to become more self-reliant and more independent. And I want to mention that in the West, the closest thing we've had to Gandhiji is Schumacher, the great economist who wrote Small is Beautiful, and who greatly influenced me when I started the work in Ladakh. So if we can understand that shifting to more localized economic activities create a space where culture and spiritual values, ecological realities shape the economy. That's what localization is about. Starting to subjugate economic transactions under an umbrella of values. In the current global economy, what we have for the first time in history, this is a completely unique situation we have. This did not happen 500 years ago. It started happening with a build-up from 500 years with slavery and colonialism. And in the modern era, we're really talking about roughly since the Second World War, or since the beginning of the 1900s. We're talking about a system that has become so global and so powerful, using media to psychologically subjugate and structurally, through the money flows, subjugate our governments, where we now have a situation where the profits of mobile banks and corporations are shaping our culture, are shaping our so-called democracy, shaping our identity. Shrinking, localizing or decentralizing is about smaller scale, it's about slower, it's about subjugating transactions to higher values. That is the structural path forward. We can't overnight suddenly decide, okay, local means we're only going to have a village economy. We're going to draw a line around a village and there'll only be a radius of, I don't know, 100 miles or something. No. We have to understand this as a systemic process, as a shift. We may be making huge progress in a certain area if we just buy apples from India instead of buying them from Argentina. The context and the realities are different in each place, but in each place around the world, people are facing a situation where generally food from 10,000 miles away costs less than food from 1 mile away. This is part of the economic literacy. It's for us to first of all recognize that fact, that butter, something that is so perishable and needs refrigeration. How can it be that I found in Kenya butter from Holland costing half as much as Kenyan butter? In England, butter from New Zealand costing a third of British butter. In fact, a third of butter from the farm down the road of where I lived in Devon, where they have plenty of dairy. Butter from New Zealand cost a third of the price. In Ladakh, butter from the other side of the Himalayas, from almond, costing half the price of local Ladakhi butter. How can it be? It's only because we have a dishonest economy, an invisible hand that is perverting economic activity, so we cannot afford local products for local people. Most of all, the worst thing that's happening is we can't afford ourselves. We can't afford to have a teacher who only teaches 10 people instead of 50 or 100. We can't afford to have a doctor who is treating fewer patients, has time for each patient. Why not? Because we're being strangled by subsidies for the large and for the machines. And machines can be useful. Part of what we need to look at is where technology can serve us and where it doesn't. And there are, lots of discussions to be had. We have, out in the lobby too, there are some of our resources, particularly the film, The Economics of Happiness, and the book, Ancient Futures, is also available in Hindi. In those materials, we go into a little bit more depth, but most of all, we've got a huge curriculum on our website with voices from India, from Africa, from the United States, global voices discussing the various issues that we need to look at. We don't have to study for years. There are certain basic principles here that can be learned very quickly. So, what can we do? What can we do? What's the most productive thing we can do? If we do see this big elephant and we realize it's harming us, what's the best thing we can do? I believe that the number one step is to inform ourselves better in a more holistic way. Not lots of data, not lots of reports. You need to see the basic pattern. And right now we're facing a situation where the trade deregulation, which is also finance deregulation, is taking on new forms, new treaties. Treaties that now legalize the situation that corporations will sue governments if they protect the environment or protect their society, protect their jobs. They'll be sued. Right now, a Swedish nuclear power company is suing Germany for 3.7 billion because they've decided to phase out nuclear. And around the world, because of the elephant, Japan, for instance, now is opening up 10 nuclear power plants, despite the fact that the majority is opposed to it. So this relationship between the big global capital and our governments, there are certain principles, and at the center of it has been global trade treaties. I feel very optimistic about this because I know that over the last 30 years, very few people were aware that these trade treaties were so important. So I see that we're in this situation primarily because of a lack of awareness, not because we're all so greedy and we don't care and all we want to do is consume and run around like, in circles trying to survive. No. It is not because we wanted to hold on to middle-class livelihoods and all kinds of myths that are put out there. It's not because of overpopulation that this is happening. It's happening because we were asleep while trade treaties were being negotiated that in the last 30 years gave so much power to this funny money and corporations. And the people inside the corporations are not very different from you and me. That for me is another very hopeful thing to know. Most of them are blindly pursuing their jobs and feeling that if they don't bring in that bit of profit as business people, or if they don't make sure that GDP keeps rising as politicians or political parties, that then they'll be out. And they're just running around blindly pursuing narrow goals, as most of us are, just trying to survive. Just taking a few minutes to step back, to breathe, to be sure to join with others, to sing and dance and reconnect, bring that power and joy in so that you're part of a group, even if it's a small group. Sangha is a good word for it too. You know, make sure you have a Sangha or a group of people that you can work with and that you can enjoy with and celebrate with. Part of that process, do also study the elephant together and help to inform larger numbers. Help to send out the DVDs, those key websites, those key organizations. Let people know more about what's happening in the rest of the world. Please help the AAP not to focus just on corrupt politicians in India, but to be aware that that structural corruption is worldwide, and we will not get rid of it if we don't change the structures, if we don't change the system. Be aware that changing the system is already happening. It is so heartening to see that despite the heavy weight of that money and all that bureaucracy and all these ways that are working against it, there is a powerful local food movement growing worldwide. There is nothing that is more diametrically opposed to this elephant system than the local food movement, which is global. There is nothing that's more important than local food. So once you start taking action, hopefully as a group, focus on local food. Be sure that you're contributing, not just as a consumer, but in an activist way, raising awareness, perhaps donating a bit of money, giving verbal support to rebuilding those food gardens, but above all to supporting local farmers. We're very honored today to have someone from Via Campesina with us. Via Campesina is the movement representative or sort of parallel to Rinpoche-ji, because Via Campesina is one of the bravest, most important, most outspoken organizations on the planet, a network of some 200 million small farmers who did understand that the trade treaties were destroying us. And I've tried to tell us for more than 20 years, please don't go along with this madness. So there are so many things happening, and they are growing. And you will be hearing from my friend Carlo about the 5-Star movement in Italy. They started an anti-corruption movement in 2006, and Carlo will report. Then we were 2 in 2006. Today we are 9 million. We took nearly 1/3 of the vote. Yeah. We took half of Berlusconi's vote. Berlusconi, who owns so much of the media. Things are happening, but we don't get to hear about them in the media, and that's again why we have to be so active, activist in getting information and passing it on. And it's in a holistic way. It's not narrow, fragmented data that people are tired of. It's not information about, oh, one more crisis, there's this dam, there's this forest being destroyed, there are GMOs, there's nuclear power. If we continue to see it as a multitude of crises, we will collapse and die. We will be fragmented and split and overwhelmed. It's when we see it as a connected system and we look at the key threads to focus on, that's when we will feel our power. And it's not just looking at that elephant, it's looking at the millions of community-inspired initiatives that are already happening. And one of the most exciting things about them, many of them don't realize that they're part of a global movement. They don't realize that they are part of literally hundreds upon hundreds of millions of things that are happening. Every time you're saving a seed, every time you're protecting the biodiversity and the flourishing of life, you are part of that movement. Life, supporting life, that's what this is about. And we can feel so much more alive. We can feel so much more joy when we connect to that. So I hope that all of you will join in this movement, this economic movement for happiness. Thank you. So we can take a few questions.
Yeah. So if you can just raise your hand and we'll we'll get the mic.
Difference between the concept of localization and the concept of Swadeshi.
The goal of localization is Swadeshi, but the process of getting there, moving towards localizing, as I said, perhaps starting by buying the apples from India instead of Argentina, in that sense, there is a difference. That we're talking about this process of where we are today, unlike when Gandhiji started. We weren't so enveloped and fragmented and torn apart by the global economy. But the end goal, I would say, is virtually identical. What I've seen is that there are very few global movements that have not been part of the globalization agenda. Even in the environmental movement, many of the big organizations, unfortunately, by pursuing a very narrow agenda, for instance, just global warming, and without an analysis, global warming, it's a problem, and it's put out as though we, in our limited consumer habits, have created that monster. No, we didn't ask to have butter from 10,000 miles away cost less than local butter. We didn't ask to have built-in obsolescence. We didn't ask to have things foisted on our children to create this enormous need. So I think that a narrow focus on ones which doesn't identify the problem is feeding into this globalizing trend. And what we need is to recognize that a global grassroots movement is needed to contend with a globalized superpower, the global elephant. That doesn't mean that we have to become all, one organization. We need to have that shared paradigm and a shared voice come out very clearly to the general public with a message. There is a way that we can have secure livelihoods and a healthy economy. And I believe, again, where I feel so aligned with Gandhiji, is it needs to be non-violent, it needs to be rooted in compassion for those individuals, those blind individuals who are still looking at things in a fragmented way, wherever they are, whether at the top or at the bottom. Compassion, kindness, and gentleness needs to be the way forward. And the big difference, though, from Gandhiji is that I think we need that global analysis and global information sharing in order to become stronger.
What's your views on massive work that's going on all over the world? Because large cities, it's a pain to the Mother Earth, and also it helps the global trade.
We need your voice. I was just saying how we need a more global movement. We desperately need your voice in the West. In the West, people have lost sight of the fact that urbanization is one of the main consequences of globalization. Urbanization is not happening because everybody wants to live in a city where it takes them an hour to travel a mile across the town. Urbanization is not happening because the youth all want to crowd into just one place. It's happening because of the funding of infrastructure and the concentration of jobs in just a few global centers. And if you think about it, I don't think this is coming out of conscious manipulation always on the part of people inside corporations. As I said, many of them are more or less like you or me, and there are good and bad, inside and outside, but very blindly they're promoting the profit of a giant. McDonald's can't have a restaurant in every village of India. Structurally, for these giants, they need the global ports and the global infrastructure to deliver to a few centers. So there is an absolute structural link between mass urbanization and globalization. And it's still happening in the West, but because it's been going on for so long, people don't see it. So beware of a sort of sustainability agenda which is about green cities. Beware that often it's completely clouding over the need to revitalize smaller towns and cities. It may be that maybe today the majority of our young people would rather be in a city. Maybe. Therefore, I think we can imagine a world of many small cities in balance with the land. We are seeing that there are more and more young people, especially in the West, who want to farm, who are leaving their computer jobs, even leaving their jobs as doctors and lawyers and highly trained engineers, going to farm on a small diversified farm with a market that has a human face, where there is a connection. They are doing very well. They are doing well financially and, just as importantly, psychologically. So the balance between smaller cities and the land, the farming and spaces for wilderness, that's the model, that's the way forward, and I think it would answer everybody's needs. Localization is the way that can help that happen.
The rich and the industrialists who have money should be the trustees of that wealth. That wealth. Trustees.
The trustees
Of the wealth. Gandhiji said that. So we have the rich, the industrialists, who we are calling them as elites. And then, and they are, the whole process is of a divergence. They are moving in a different direction. We are talking about localization and in a different direction. Both are diverging. Do you think there is any point in which these diverging views can merge?
I used to speak at the World Bank, at the IMF, at Harvard, at Oxford. In the last 20 years, no invitations from there. Almost all the interesting and wonderful things that are happening are smaller scale, underfunded, independent, and as of yet, there is no big funding for the big picture ideas. We need funding. Any of you who can help, we need it. But I am thrilled to see how much has happened without it. Like I say, the local food movements that have grown, have gone in direct opposition, had no help with funding, nothing from the media, nothing from government. And they grew and grew and grew, and now they're beginning to get help, but beware of some of that help, because it often tends to co-opt it a bit. So, nevertheless, we do need funding that would support the sort of think tank type of work to give the statistics on redundant trade, built-in obsolescence, the real reasons for our terrible ecological and social crises. But we can do so much without it if we get together in smaller groups. And I would urge not thinking, okay, we need to change the power structure, let's go and talk to the powerful, let's go and talk to the people in government, the people in big business. No, let's talk to each other. We need to have much greater clarity and put out our platform. Let's talk to those who are clearly already concerned. The spiritual movements, the social movements, the ecological movements, the amnesties, concerned with human rights, everyone concerned with poverty, with injustice, with peace and conflict. Let us realize that all of us will benefit by continuing with our special concerns and doing what we can, but being part of a very big voice and a very clear platform that may take on many different colors and many different agendas, but fundamentally has a structural and systemic answer. And I believe that it has to be localizing or decentralizing. We may call it something else, we may choose other words, but that's the direction. So let us be really clear. I think that if over the next few years, learning a bit from the five-star movement in Italy, if over the next 5 years we focus on that, I think we can do it. We do not need the majority, because everybody knows that there's something fundamentally wrong. Everybody is suffering, including the CEOs. We're running faster and faster and faster and faster, chasing the tail of a machine-based economy that has no need for people. It's just, so I don't think we need to talk to the powerful right now. Let's talk to each other. And we are the power. We are the 99%. We are the real power.
On globalisation, do you think if we can holistically describe the elephant and make people understand, do you think that a lot of those people will leave those movements or transform them from within so that they will actually become allied to what you're talking about? Also, you talk about Gandhiji, about non-violence, and I obviously totally agree with you. He also said that we need to be active and provocative. What's your opinion on that? I mean, do we need to sort of force the issue a little bit? I mean, there's this massive shell of an ego around globalisation? Maybe it just needs to be pushed a bit.
In terms of your question, I'll start with the second one first. In terms of being provocative, I think we should use a bit of humour and a bit of provocation. But let's remember, not right now, the target is not to ridicule or demonize the people who work inside Coca-Cola or inside Goldman Sachs. It is not about a politics of identity and individuals. We really need to understand the structures. And it's not that when we've had a small bank, which by the way, I didn't talk enough about many of the good things that are happening. I know Manish will get after me later. There are a lot of very exciting things happening, even in terms of financial investments in local businesses. There are local businesses alliances. There's our close colleague in our alliance, Michael Schumann, is one of the leading economists in the world, developing these instruments that allow people to start investing in local businesses and local economies, and where they can see what they do. We have to move away from this drone economy. So being provocative, yes, but maybe also with ourselves. Maybe we need to joke a little bit about ourselves.
We'll have some closing remarks
we've done. But
at
more than
6:15
anything,
roughly,
I think we need
if we are
this
able to
clarity
keep to the schedule
of
which we
spelling
hope
out
to.
key elements
And the
of
schedule here
intervention.
also talks of celebrating, you know.
Like the Occupy movement, just Occupy banks.
Yeah, okay. So he was saying, he didn't mean demonize, he was saying more maybe like the Occupy movement. I felt that the Occupy movement was premature. I felt that if the people who were willing to go out and sit in Wall Street and sit on the street had had a clearer analysis of what they were against and what they were for, that they would have been much stronger. So I feel we need a little phase, maybe it's only a year, you know, and it varies from place to place, of developing a clearer agenda. Because I think if the Occupy movement, which did get some media coverage, had been able to speak more clearly, one thing I'm afraid of is at this stage, as small as they were, they probably wouldn't have got the same media coverage. You know, if you look at Via Campesina, they've been very clear, and most people don't know about them. So we need to build up the numbers. Let's remember that. We need to build up the numbers, which is why outreach and education is so important, so we can really have a situation, yes, where we refuse. We refuse to pay taxes that are going to be translated into a bonus for big bankers. We start building a strong enough movement to really say no and to say what we're for.
Last question.
So this example about butter, you know, from New Zealand being cheaper. So my first question is, so I'm probably going to buy that cheaper butter rather than the locally produced butter, right? Because I want to save money.
Yeah.
So is it not me wanting, you know, this whole thing to happen? That is one part of the question, and it may be because of twisted subsidies for the, you know, global and so on. The second part of the question is, so what can I do in this situation? So if locally I understand this now, what can I do? Because, you know, just that 3 times the money is coming in the way.
This is what I've seen the environmental movement generally do, is to say to people, if you care about food, you should be willing to pay more for it. And if you care about the environment and a good landscape, pay more for it. They haven't been saying, most people around the world would prefer to have fresh local butter at an affordable price. They didn't ask to have butter from the other side of the world that also is laden with all kinds of preservatives and is old, and this is now true of vegetables, of meat, you know, it's crisscrossing. The US exports about 900,000 tons of beef and imports about 900,000 tons of beef. This is another part of the picture. You know, literally crisscrossing. And we're talking about water, we're talking about milk. UK exports as much milk and butter as it imports. Why? Because if we all tomorrow, imagine a world tomorrow where everyone was sitting down to eat staples from the region, no multinational would make money. The economic system from the get-go was about global trade. It started with global slavery and trade from Europe. We have to question that in a systemic, holistic way. So, what can you do when you go to shop and the local thing costs 3 times as much? Don't feel guilty if you buy the cheaper thing, number one. Don't point your finger at other people and say, oh, you don't care about the land. Instead, say, let's work together to raise awareness. Let's work together to start creating local food initiatives where we start bringing down the price of the fresh and the local while still paying the growers a decent price. And we can give you many examples of where that does happen. It doesn't happen nearly as miraculously and beautifully and efficiently as it would if this weren't operating, the local weren't operating within a system of heavy subsidies. So it's a miracle that the local food movement has been able to achieve what it has within those distorting subsidies. So please help support the growth of those, but also spread the message that we need to support them on a much larger scale. Let's have a campaign that every citizen lets their government know we do not want to subsidize Monsanto and Walmart. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Helena.